we've got a pair of high-priced, big-name fighter retirements in the last 24 hours. So let's give them their flowers right here, Luke. Big news this week. 4-time UFC title contender and longtime flyweight veteran Joe Benavidez calls it a career, Luke, a 28-8 record. Also Carlos Condit, but let's start here on Joe B, Luke. As classy and as regular a dude, jiu-jitsu, as you can find in this game, and consistently, Luke, one of the best in this sport. Just, you hate to say it as the first line of his obit one day, never got over that hill, but boy, did he go out swinging in trying to do so, Luke. He was one of the faces of this division since it was first launched. Demetrius Johnson was sort of that boss at the end of the video game he had problems getting over. But you look back at an incredible career, a fight of the year victory over Henry Cejudo. Joe B was as good as it gets in this game, Luke. How will you remember Mr. Olivi in this case?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say enough good things about him. And I said this in the live chat yesterday, BC, which is worth repeating. We measure greatness a little too limited in MMA, where it's like, okay, we'll start with who was champions and then we'll go from there. But you can't convince me that his resume isn't better than some people who wore hardware around their waist. It just was, in part because for a long stretch of his career, he wasn't even competing in his normal effing weight class. In fact, his first 4 losses came to Demetrius Johnson and Dominic Cruz. The Dominic Cruz fight, he lost twice. But that was a 135. Like, do you even want to count that? I mean, you can count it, but like, it just doesn't represent him. And then the first Demetrius Johnson fight was a split decision loss. Okay, he got KO'd in the second one. But you get the idea. Like, dude, this was a guy who was out there unnaturally competing way above his weight. And to me, what he represents is that first, not the post-tough boom. The post-tough boom ushered in people who were kind of already there, who were in that sort of UFC-ready weight classes. There was a second wave just behind it of people who were that sort of WEC come up, where 145, 135, and so forth, who were able to do pretty, and 125 eventually, as you saw, who were able to do pretty spectacular things. And Team Alpha Male, I think, kind of had the playbook from like 2008 to 2015-ish, 2016-ish. On how to be a really dominant wrestle boxer in this game, and he was a big part of it. He may have not had the celebrity per se of Uriah Faber or the hardware of Demetrius Johnson, but dude, he kind of split the difference there a little bit. He was extremely talented. He showed how good fighting could be at a lower weight class. He did it outside of his weight class. To me, he's a really special talent. He's a guy deserving of a ton of accolades. He fought until it really wasn't possible to go any further, and he called it off. Maybe you could have called it off after the second, Figueiredo loss, but he wanted to give it one more try. But dude, listen to the names he's beaten. Okay, and again, some of these are going to be up a weight class. Danny Martinez, Jeff Curran, Big Frog, who is a big name, Hani Yahya, Miguel Torres, folks won't know this, but this is a very good fighter, Vagny Fabiano, Ian Loveland, Eddie Wineland, Yasuhiro Urushitani, who was a dominant force in that weight class over in Japan until they brought him over, Ian McCall, Darren Yuyan Oyama, Jussier Formiga, Tim Elliott, Dustin Ortiz, John Moraga, Ali Bagautinov, Zach McCoskey, Henry Cejudo, don't forget that, Alex Perez, Dustin Ortiz, and Jussier Formiga. Again, dude, that is a baller-ass resume if ever there was one.
Yeah, I feel like because he never won the title in either promotion, that there would be people that will forget about him over time. Yet, Luke, we talk about the four kings in boxing in the 1980s and the great Showtime documentary about Leonard, Hearns, Duran, and Hagler. There's a fifth king in that, Wilfred Benitez, Luke, who lost to Sugar Ray Leonard, but lost to Hearns, but beat Duran, who sometimes people say, is just as good as those four and fought most of them, but doesn't get linked with that. You just laid out the names of the guys who brought life to the idea of small fighters, of fighting, below, lightweight or featherweight, whatever, the faces of the WEC. We think back of that era. We think Dominic Cruz. We think, Uriah Faber, Jose Aldo, Demetrius Johnson, the small weight guys who, transitioned to the UFC and were the faces. And Joe was right there with them, Luke. He fought in the inaugural UFC flyweight title bout, that split decision you mentioned in his first fight with Demetrius Johnson, and it could have just as easily gone his way on the scorecards that night. But I think more than anything, Luke, along with being a great guy, and I always thought he was a very wise quote, a very thoughtful quote, he stayed at a super elite level for a long-ass time. He's 37 years old. He walks away on a 3-fight losing skid, yet, went for it twice against Figueiredo and, was in that Askarov fight and, given everything he had left. So he was able to keep it at a high level for a long time. And Luke, considering he's been more or less on top for a long-ass time, he was one of the first really, really well-rounded, perfect sort of fighters in that regard at an early time as people were rotating from specialization into being complete mixed martial artists. I always thought he was a threat in all aspects of his game. He changed with the times in that regard and stayed up very high. And sad to see him go, but it seems like the right choice, Luke. And I don't want to...
I would challenge that a little bit. I think you're right, BC. You're absolutely right that, again, he started making a name for himself in a big way around 2008 or so. And those guys out of Team Alpha Male, I think they wrote the book for that era on wrestle boxing. They really did. No one did it better than them, particularly in those weight classes. They had a game kind of perfectly situated for their body size. But eventually, I think what cost them is not just the age, but the striking game kind of moved on past what they were able to do. A lot of them just sort of leap into range in that way that they did in that time, which, again, in that era was perfectly serviceable for winning big fights, as you can see. But it ended up not being enough. The one thing I want to point out is he never had back-to-back losses throughout the course of his career until the Figueiredo pairing, and then, of course, Askarov on top. Other than that, if he had a win, he always rebounded. In fact, he got KO'd by Demetrius Johnson, one punch in the first round, right? We all remember that. After that, he went on a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 fight win streak, which included Tim Elliott with the guillotine choke, where Tim had to tap with his feet because he was getting guillotined from mount and his arms were completely closed. Dustin Ortiz, Moraga, Bagotinov, Makovsky, and then Henry Cejudo. Dude, that is a very, very good resume.
So, Luke, we hate to have this conversation, but it comes up even in the NBA when we talk about greats like Charles Barkley or Karl Malone, who were, top 10, top 20 talent of all time, but never got the ring. Where do you place him on that countdown? The one that Michael Bisping used to head off, that now includes Dan Henderson, Dustin Poirier, the guys who have never won a full UFC championship, but have certainly been of that ilk. Is he up there with Faber and Hendo and those guys? Where would you put a number on him, Luke?
Yeah. I don't know what the number would be, but if you're asking me, does he belong in consideration with one of the best lighter weight fighters of all time? Sure, absolutely. I just don't without making a list, it's hard to know where to put. Do you have a better number? Like, do you know where you would put him?
I mean, top 5, I think I've got to put Henderson above him and Faber, yeah, and Poirier for now. He's right there, though, Luke. He's freaking right there. I'll tell you that much. He had the chance twice against Figueiredo. We were hoping he was going to sort of get that Bisping moment, that opportunity, but didn't get it. It doesn't soften an incredible career. But Luke, our second retirement, same age at 37, active of late, the great Carlos Condit. Luke, I want to throw it to you because you love his seminal title war with Robbie Lawler and appreciate that fight maybe more than anyone I know. Talk to me about the feels of seeing Carlos Condit, a former welterweight interim champion, say goodbye.
It's a tough one because I kind of thought it should have happened a little bit sooner, but I don't think it's a disaster that it happened now. In other words, did he wait too long? Maybe a little bit, but not so badly, I hope. But dude, what can you say? I mean, I said this on Twitter, there are careers and then there's what Carlos Condit did, Understand what we're talking about here with somebody. We are talking about somebody who made his pro debut less than a year after 9/11, and he did it in fucking Mexico. He went down there and just beat up some guy. Through all of the aughts and everything else, he worked himself to a championship level and did it without, you could say maybe in the Diaz fight, he kind of compromised his style, but more often than not, in basic terms, he never, ever changed the way he was, which was just complete gameness. And how do you define gameness? Gameness is pursuit of the fight despite the physical consequences. I mean, if that's not Carlos Condit, I don't know who is. And that you can do that all the way through the championship level is absolutely remarkable. He came into from the WEC to the UFC very much as an afterthought. Folks didn't know, the hardcores did, but the casuals didn't really know much about him. And then he had a fucking war with Martin Kampmann, and he earned every fighter's respect. He earned every fan's respect. He achieved great things. And you mentioned that Lawler fight. Dude, that Lawler fight, if you've not seen it, I don't think either of them were ever the same after that. I don't think Robbie Lawler's retirement is very far from where we are right now. And I'll say this, that if that's not the best fight in welterweight history, it's the most thrilling. And it's thrilling in part because of what Carlos Condit did. The sacrifice he laid on the altar of athletic greatness to achieve something, and about, I thought he won, by the way, is astounding. You will not see guys like this very often who are absolute fire eaters and at the same time championship level fighters. It is extremely rare, and he was that personified.
He was a human highlight reel. He had a sick side to him that would just go after it, which was best exemplified in that Lawler fight. And while that's your favorite, I can't put it above Lawler McDonald, but I do think it had a fifth round. I'm talking about Lawler Condit that is on pace, on par with any round in terms of just the go after it, and the stakes were high and the shit. Luke, for as much as we know him as such a celebrated and loved blood and guts warrior, you talk about that WEC debut in 2007, that through 2012, so right before his title loss to GSP in 2012, Luke, he went 10-1, with the only loss being a split decision to Martin Kampmann, which, as you mentioned, was a frickin' war. And his wins during that 10-1 run across WEC and UFC are highlighted by Jake Ellenberger, Rory McDonald, Dan Hardy, Stun Gun, and Nick Diaz, Luke. God, that is a frickin' and there's like 3 straight knockouts in the midst of that against those names where you're talking about a natural born killer indeed.
Dude, and don't forget, the McDonald fight, Rory was beating the shit out of him through 2 rounds, and then in the third, if my memory serves, he turned it around and then punished McDonald to the point where he baited a referee stoppage. It was incredible. Follows that up with a 1-punch KO of Dan Hardy, follows that up with a double switch knee on the stun gun, Jong Hyun Kim, and then follows that up by winning an interim title against Nick Diaz. I mean, you got to be fucking kidding me. That is just otherworldly levels of ability. I mean, yes, there are guys who did more. St. Pierre, obviously. You can say some other ones perhaps as well, but we are talking about a very, very unique fighter, the likes of which will not be repeated anytime soon.
And we don't have a self-made list of rankings in front of us of who are the best welterweights in sports history up and down. But when you look at the names of those victories that I just mentioned, the high level of them, and the fact that he did win an interim title, even though I don't love the presence and the use of interim titles, Luke, that's a freaking impeccable resume for a guy who I think too many people think about the blood and guts fight of the night side of him, which is fine because he was that guy. But you want to talk about the accomplishments on top of that. He really is one of the best all-time greats. I mean, there's no, I didn't like seeing him hang on and be a slower fraction of himself the last couple of years. But when he was at his best, dude, good Lord. I mean,
well, I'm glad he retired because, losing to Robbie Lawler had to be difficult. But then he fought Demian Maia. Okay. Then he fought Neil Magny, who's, a top-ranked fighter. And then Alex Oliveira was a bit of a tough one to swallow. But then Chiesa, he's a top-ranked fighter. And then he goes in the wins against McGee and Brown. Those are nice. And then he lost to Max Griffin, who I think is a good fighter. But you have to ask yourself, would a guy like Carlos have lost to a guy like Max 5-6 years ago? Probably not. And so I think for that reason, he was like, okay, let's just call it a day before there's any damage done. And I'm pretty glad. But I agree with you, dude. Like, in boxing, where you have so many titles, I think you can use titles as a baseline for who did something and didn't. Like, it would be very hard for me to think about, like, who's the best boxer who never won a title. You could answer that question obviously a lot better than I can, but is it anybody even remarkable? In MMA, dude, and of course he got the interim title, and he was the WEC champion, so he did have hardware. But I'm saying a full-on UFC title, he never got it. Dude, you rob everyone, not you, but like the proverbial you, of history if you don't tell the story of people like this, even though he didn't get a full weight class title.
It's like I almost don't want to put him in that list I just talked about with Benavidez because he does have the WEC title and the interim title, which together should almost equal. Just like Dan Henderson's hard to put in that list because everything he accomplished elsewhere outside of the UFC. What a freaking great career. And it just, it's not his fault he was in the GSP era. And, it's not his fault that although he gave what was left of him against Lawler, Luke, that was a split decision. It could have gone either way. I mean, he could have exited that night, although that was the first of a 5-fight losing streak, probably justified. So, justifiably given the damage, but, he could have just as easily been the champion that night. So what a remarkable run, 32-14 for the 37-year-old to walk away but that almost doesn't really matter in the end, Luke. It's what he left behind. An ambassador, too, for what the UFC was really, marketing itself to be. And
also, like, if you just look at, if you look at like where he fought in the early stages of his career, he tells the story of MMA at the time. Like, he had a lot of regional fights in the New Mexico area, and then he got really his first big start in Japan. This was in 2005. Dude, Japan had a massive MMA scene at the time, and then he went in his real big introduction to the big stage. You could maybe say the Kitawaka fight he had in Pancrase, but I would argue it'd be the Rumble on the Rock, and where he beat Renato Verissimo, who was, folks who may not know, that was BJ Penn's jiu-jitsu coach for a long time. And then he triangled Frank Trick. He did lose ultimately to Jake Shields. Obviously, Jake Shields is very talented. But, that's when he announced that he was a player among the top welterweights in the world. And so he went and ended up in WEC not too long after that, after returning to Pancrase. So, it's just an interesting way to look back in time, so to speak.
And he was at his best at that point, right around the WEC merging into the UFC, where the sport had really started to make major inroads in the mainstream. And Luke, I just remember like the kind of tough dudes with tats and an Affliction t-shirt and a chain that listened to like, early 2000s hard nu metal NU. Those guys, Carlos Condit was their favorite fighter. Like, no question. Every guy you ran into like at a bar who you could tell like fights and you talk to him, and dude, he was every single one of those guys, rightfully so. Just an absolute badass favorite fighter. It seemed like people were either a Cowboy guy or a Condit guy back then, Luke. The real fans, Luke. You know what I'm saying?
Kind of interesting they never fought,
Yeah, that is very interesting.